Clint Eastwood was standing at the podium during Paul Newman's private memorial service when he suddenly stopped reading his prepared remarks and folded the paper in half. The small church in Westport, Connecticut, had gone completely still. What Clint said next wasn't supposed to be shared, a deathbed conversation that Paul had whispered to him just 72 hours before he passed. Joanne Woodward's hand flew to her mouth. Robert Redford lowered his head. By the time Clint finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, and Hollywood would never look at either legend the same way again. The morning of September 30th, 2008 arrived gray and quiet in Westport, Connecticut. A soft rain had fallen overnight, leaving the trees around St. Luke's Parish glistening under a pale sky. The small Episcopal church had been chosen deliberately. No grand cathedral, no Hollywood spectacle. Paul Newman had wanted it simple, and Joanne Woodward was determined to honor that wish. The guests began arriving just after 10 in the morning, their black cars winding through the narrow New England roads that Paul had driven countless times on his way to the racetrack or to his charity camp for sick children. The church held fewer than 200 people, and every seat was reserved for those who had actually known him, not executives, not agents, not the industry machine that had made him famous, but real friends and family. Robert Redford arrived early, wearing a simple black suit and dark sunglasses that he didn't remove even inside. He sat in the third row beside a window, staring at the wooden cross above the altar like he was looking for answers it couldn't provide. Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson sat quietly near the back. George Clooney, who had worked with Newman on charity projects, kept checking his phone before finally turning it off and slipping it into his pocket with a look of shame. Joanne Woodward sat in the front row, flanked by her daughters. At 87 years old, she had been married to Paul for 50 years, a Hollywood miracle that both of them had attributed to spending enough time apart. Her face was composed, almost serene, but those who knew her could see the devastation in her stillness. Clint Eastwood arrived at exactly 10:45, alone. He wore a dark navy suit with a black tie. Understated, no flash. He nodded at a few familiar faces but didn't stop to talk, finding a seat near the side aisle where he could see the podium without being the center of attention. In his jacket pocket was a single folded piece of paper containing remarks he'd written the night before on hotel stationery. He had no idea that within the hour he would abandon every word of it. The service began with a hymn that Paul had loved, followed by readings from Scripture that felt almost secondary to the weight of who was being mourned. A few people spoke first: a childhood friend from Cleveland, one of Paul's racing partners, a counselor from the hole-in-the-wall gang camp, who described how Paul would show up unannounced just to flip burgers for the kids. Each story painted a picture of a man who had spent his final decades trying to give away everything Hollywood had given him. Then the minister announced that Clint Eastwood would share some words. A murmur rippled through the pews, not loud, but noticeable. Most people hadn't known Clint and Paul were close. They were icons of the same era, sure, but different orbits. Newman was the method actor, the blue-eyed perfectionist who agonized over every role. Eastwood was the instinctive gunslinger who shot films fast and never looked back. They had never made a movie together. To most of Hollywood, they were parallel lines that never intersected. Clint rose slowly from his seat, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the podium. His footsteps echoed against the stone floor. When he reached the microphone, he pulled out the folded piece of paper from his pocket and smoothed it against the wooden surface. He cleared his throat and began reading. Something about craft, about legacy, about how Paul had represented the best of what their generation could offer. But halfway through the second paragraph, Clint stopped. His eyes lifted from the paper and drifted toward Joanne in the front row. Something passed across his face. A flicker of hesitation, maybe doubt, maybe resolve. The pause stretched long enough that people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Robert Redford looked up, his sunglasses now removed, watching Clint with sudden intensity. He recognized that look. Something was happening that wasn't in the program. Clint folded the paper in half, then in half again, and slipped it back into his pocket. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher, stripped of the formal tone he'd started with. "I had something prepared," he said, "but Paul deserves the truth." The church went absolutely still. Even the soft sounds of crying seemed to pause, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Clint gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles whitening. "Most of you probably didn't know that Paul and I were friends. We kept it that way on purpose. Hollywood loves to pit people against each other. The cowboy versus the method actor, the tough guy versus the pretty boy. We let them tell that story because it was easier than explaining the real one." He paused, his eyes moving across the faces before him. Tom Hanks leaned forward in his seat. George Clooney had stopped fidgeting entirely. "We met in 1968 at a fundraiser neither of us wanted to be at. Got stuck at the same table, started talking about cars, and didn't stop for 40 years. Phone calls at midnight, dinners when we were both in New York. He'd tell me when my movies were garbage, and I'd tell him when he was being too precious about a role. That's what real friendship is, someone who doesn't need anything from you except honesty." Joanne Woodward's composure began to crack. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't move to wipe it away. She was watching Clint with an expression that seemed to be equal parts surprise and recognition, as if she was hearing confirmation of something she'd always suspected, but never fully understood. "3 days before he died," Clint continued, his voice dropping even lower, "I got a call from Joanne. She said Paul was asking for me. I canceled everything and flew out that night. Got to the house around midnight." Robert Redford closed his eyes. His jaw tightened visibly, and those sitting near him could see his hands trembling slightly against his thighs. He hadn't known about this visit. Nobody had. He was in bed. Couldn't weigh more than 130 pounds. The cancer had taken almost everything. Clint's voice caught for just a moment before he steadied himself. But his eyes were still sharp. "Still, Paul." He looked at me and said, "Took you long enough, cowboy." A soft, broken laugh escaped from somewhere in the pews, someone who recognized Paul's humor even in his final moments. But the laughter faded quickly, swallowed by the weight of what was coming. Clint's hands were shaking now. He didn't try to hide it. I sat with him for about 2 hours that night. Joanne gave us the room. We talked about the old days at first, the races, the films, the times we almost worked together, but couldn't make the schedules line up. But then Paul got quiet. And when Paul Newman got quiet, you knew something was coming. He stopped, looking down at the podium as if gathering the strength to continue. The silence in the church was so complete that the distant sound of a car passing on the road outside felt like an intrusion. He told me he had one regret, just one. Out of everything, the Oscars, the marriages before Joanne, the times he wasn't there for his kids, he said there was only one thing that still kept him up at night. Clint looked directly at Robert Redford. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Redford's face had gone pale. His lips pressed into a thin line. He said, "I spent my whole career trying to be someone else. Every role, every character. I crawled inside them because I didn't want anyone to see who I really was. I was terrified that if people saw the real Paul Newman, they wouldn't think he was enough." A choked sob came from the front row. One of Paul's daughters had buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Joanne sat motionless, tears streaming freely now, her eyes never leaving Clint's face. I told him that was ridiculous. I told him he was the most authentic person I'd ever known. But he shook his head and grabbed my hand, harder than you'd think a dying man could grip. and he said, "That's because you only saw what I wanted you to see. The only person who ever saw all of me was Joanne, and I never told her that enough." Clint turned toward Joanne. "He wanted you to know." Joanne Woodward let out a sound that no one in that church would ever forget, a raw, guttural cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Her daughters reached for her, but she held up a hand to stop them. She needed to hear this. She needed all of it. Clint's composure finally shattered. Tears spilled down his weathered face as he gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The man who had built a career on stoic silence, on the unshakable squint, on never letting them see him bleed, that man was gone. In his place stood a 78-year-old who had just lost one of the only people who truly knew him. "The last thing he said to me," Clint managed, his voice barely above a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the church, was, "Tell them I wasn't cool. Tell them I was scared every single day. Tell them the whole thing, the racing, the salad dressing, the charity. It was all just a guy trying to earn the life he'd been given." Clint's legs buckled slightly. He caught himself on the podium, and Tom Hanks half rose from his seat as if preparing to rush forward. But Clint steadied himself, wiping his face with the back of his hand. And then he said, "Promise me you won't waste your time like I did. Promise me you'll tell the people you love what they mean to you before it's too late. Don't be like me, Clint. Don't wait until you're dying to be honest." Robert Redford stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. Everyone turned to look at him, but he wasn't leaving. He was crying, openly, without shame, his shoulders heaving. He brought his hands together and began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder. One by one others rose. Tom Hanks, George Clooney, the camp counselors and racing buddies and family members. Within seconds, the entire church was standing, applauding through their tears. Not for Clint, but for Paul, for the truth, for the man behind the blue eyes who had finally, through someone else's voice, been fully seen. Clint didn't return to his seat. He walked straight down the center aisle, past the standing mourners, past the tear-streaked faces, and out the front door of the church into the pale Connecticut morning. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to be anywhere but inside that room full of people who had just watched him break apart. Robert Redford found him 20 minutes later, sitting alone on a wooden bench behind the church, staring at nothing. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Redford sat down beside him and said quietly, 50 years I knew him. He never told me any of that." Clint nodded slowly. He couldn't. That was the point. The two men sat together until the other mourners began filing out, their silhouettes visible through the trees. It was the first and the last real conversation Clint Eastwood and Robert Redford would ever have. In the weeks that followed, the eulogy became legend. No recordings existed. Joanne had forbidden cameras, but fragments leaked out through whispers and second-hand accounts. Entertainment journalists chased the story, but everyone who had been inside that church refused to share details. It was sacred. It was theirs. Clint returned to work almost immediately, throwing himself into post-production on Gran Torino. Those who worked with him noticed something different, a softness that hadn't been there before. He started ending phone calls with, "I appreciate you." He told his children he loved them more often, small changes that only those closest to him could see. Years later, in a rare interview, Clint was asked about his friendship with Paul Newman. He smiled, a real smile, not the performative kind he gave journalists, and said simply, "He taught me that strength isn't about what you hide. It's about what you're brave enough to show." Paul Newman's grave in Westport has no elaborate headstone, no Hollywood fanfare, just a simple marker beside a tree. But those who visit sometimes notice a second set of flowers that appears every September. No card, no name, just white lilies left by someone who never forgot a promise made at midnight to a dying friend.